I wasn't going to say this, but I'm going to. Ing's gone visiting her family with my two older children, so it's me and 1.5-year-old Enid for the weekend. And each night we've been doing this thing where I put on some music and we just dance around the living room, and I hold her and we kind of snuggle and dance around, and it's real fun for both of us. And I thought maybe, as we were singing right then, I thought maybe that's like what God wants for us, is to kind of wrap us up and hold us and just kind of dance around and have us, connect with Him in worship. And so I hope, it's like we have so many hours in a week, I hope that this hour together, there's like some kind of transcendent thing happening where you can be in deep and intimate relationship with God. That was all for free, so that was, I'll get to my papers now. In church, I think we oftentimes say something like, we want to tell people the truth, right? We don't water it down, give folks the real truth. People need to hear the truth. Okay. So here it is. The truth is that the church in America is in decline. The truth is that the church in America is in decline. Not so much the rest of the world. South America, Africa, Asia, things are going crazy. America and Europe, the church is in decline. For the first time since these kind of measures have been taken, just this past year, less than 50% of American adults are members at some church congregation. And membership isn't, the only thing. There's a rise, if you follow any of this kind of thing, in young folks, people particularly in their 20s, who claim, when asked about God, they claim they have no religious affiliation. Right? The idea is, I'm not religiously affiliated with anything. And it's not just young people, it's even older people than that are all claiming that sort of idea now. Even those who attend church are attending less frequently. Now, hear me clearly, because I'm not primarily concerned about church membership, and I'm not primarily concerned with church attendance. Here's what I am concerned about, though. That the church is culturally viewed, at best, as kind of an inconvenience or something that's irrelevant to people's real lives, and at worst, as actually destructive. And I think that there's a lot of people in the world that view the Christian church in that kind of a way. And I think there's a tendency nowadays, kind of post-2020, for a lot of Christians to say, well, let's blame lower church attendance on COVID, right? Like there's people that used to be part of a church here or other churches that are now kind of gone away from church, and it's because of COVID. And if we could just kind of have COVID be done, we could get people back, and we can go back to the way it was. Well, I'm here to be the bearer of bad news today and say that I don't think that's really going to solve the deeper problem. What I think is this, that COVID has only accelerated, it's only sped up a trend that's been happening for probably at least the past 20 years in America, where people are less and less inclined to connect with, be associated with, be members of, or attend churches. And I think that, yes, we need to respond to COVID and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately we need to get underneath that if we want to talk about where we're going together as a church. What about here at Kish? Our average attendance, on past couple of months has been somewhere close to what it was in 2019, pre-pandemic. And you might say, well, that seems good, like there's good things happening here at Kish, so why are you telling us all this, Luke? Why rain on that parade? Well, I would argue that most of our increase in people coming to Kish have been folks from other churches. And I'm not going to say anything about that, but ultimately our vision has to be something like getting connected or getting the gospel to people who don't know Jesus and having their lives transformed from it. There has to be a bigger vision than just switching Christians around between churches. And I'm also intimately familiar with our church and kind of the challenge of those 20-year-olds I talked about earlier that have no religious affiliation. Ing and I worked with the post-high group here before switching to pastoring, and every church is struggling to find 20-year-old people in their 20s that are part of that church. And so if that's you today, God bless you by all means. We love that you're here. But we really need to think through, because 50 years down the road, those 20-year-olds are going to be in their 70s, and what's going to happen in between. It's because of the truth of this problem, and also I think because of the place where we're at, where we've kind of gone through a lot of the pastoral transition stuff. We are, wherever we are related to COVID, that I feel kind of in my gut that right now we need to talk about who we are as a church and where we're going. Who we are as a church and where we're going. Like I said last week, we want to ask God to be involved. We want to pray and ask Him to be in the driver's seat, steering wheel, all that business. But we want to ask these kinds of questions. Questions like, what does the Bible say about the mission of the church? Right? Like, not what culturally do we expect out of a church, but what does the truth of the Bible say about what a church ought to look like? We want to see how we can create a vision that is more effective. And as we just talked about in the men's class this morning, really we want to ask the question, like, what even does a healthy church look like? And I'm not convinced that it looks like the most amount of people sitting in seats on a Sunday morning. I don't think that's really the truth. But we want to ask these kinds of questions. And so that's our plan kind of for this upcoming fall season, is to really dig into that kind of stuff together as a church. The passage we're going to use, which is why you see all this stuff up here, to sort of guide us through this sermon series, comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. The key verse is number 7. It says this, it says, we have, and thanks Ben for nailing those songs this morning, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Let me break that down into two pieces. We'll do the treasure, and then we'll do the jars. Treasure and jars. To describe the treasure, we have to first go backwards, because Paul says we have this treasure. Well, what treasure is he referring to? Let's go 2 verses back. Verses 5 and 6 of 2 Corinthians 4 says this. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. See, the treasure is the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus. It is not, my friends, primarily about us. We can't be about proclaiming ourselves. We have to be about proclaiming Jesus as Lord over everything. Now, I would say that everyone needs this treasure of Jesus. Everyone needs the treasure of Jesus. One way to think about that is this. Are there people who are lost? In other words, are there people who don't know how to orient themselves to face the realities of the world these days, right? They're confused. They don't know which way to turn or what to do next. Are there people like that out there? Or are there people who are cynical anytime anybody says that they know what's true, and they say, yeah, right, you're just trying to convince me of this, that, or the other thing, right? You're just using this to claim that you know what's right and I don't. And I feel like everybody these days, like you watch the news and you're like, this person said this person said this, I have no idea who to trust. Are there people like that these days? Are there people that are, I'm going to steal a phrase that my wife has used, living while dying, right? These are people who are technically alive, but you can tell by their posture or by their emotional state that there's not a vibrancy. If anything, they're kind of barely barely alive. And if you agree that there are people in those kinds of categories in the world today, then this treasure that we've been singing about and talking about, Jesus, says in John 14, in a verse that I'm sure you're familiar with, he says that Jesus, he himself is the way. What does that mean? He's the way. Meaning he, out of any person, knows the path to go forward to face this world in the correct direction. He says that he is the truth. What does that mean? That means underlying every claim that everybody has of how they're going to use truth to power and lord over you, Jesus actually is the actual truth. He's a fundamental true reality that you can rest in. And he's the life. And what's cool about Jesus is he doesn't say, I'm the life, I'm like the kind of, I'll barely keep you alive and you can stumble along through this world and then eventually you'll get to something good. He says, I'm here to give you life and to give it to you to the full, to give it to you abundantly, right? And so this treasure Jesus is, I would say, the exact response that the world needs when they don't know the way, don't know the truth, and don't have life. And so if everybody needs to know about this treasure, then I think we could say that the mission of the church is to share that treasure with other people. Right? Like our role as a church, the mission we literally have been given is share, or as Paul would say, to spread the aroma of Jesus, to share Jesus with the world. And yet, that treasure is inside of clay jars, right? Sort of like these guys up here. That treasure is inside of clay, kind of made out of dirt, hardened vessels to hold stuff. And that's us. And we're fragile, and we're just sort of every day. I don't know how many of y'all have clay pots around your house, but I thought it's probably something relevant to a canning jar that we would think of today. It's kind of like they're a dime a dozen, they're everywhere they are, and they're going to hold stuff, and if it breaks, no big deal. Right, we'll get another. That's what it's talking about here. And that's exactly why Paul says, what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord. We proclaim the treasure inside of the jar, not the jar itself. Now, I know this will sound obvious, but I think it's important. The treasure is not the jar. The treasure is not the jar. The treasure is inside of the jar. The treasure is inside of the jar. It's carried around, but it's not the jar itself. But I think, even in churches, and the human sinful nature of pride makes it so stinking tempting for us to proclaim ourselves, right? Like, come to our church. We're cool. We have great music, right? We have friendly people. We have, like, whatever. We want to proclaim ourselves instead of pointing to the treasure. This happens when church leaders, and I can honestly understand, folks, why so many people are disenfranchised towards the church. When so many prominent church leaders have made it about proclaiming themselves and making their own platform instead of proclaiming and turning everything towards Jesus. This also happens when we proclaim the truth, but we do it in judgmental ways. In essence, what we say is something like, yeah, we have the truth, we have the treasure in Jesus, but because we have him, we're better than you other folks. This also happens when we proclaim the treasure and we say something like, Jesus, we sing today and this kind of thing, Jesus is so worthwhile, he's such a great treasure, but we don't even attempt to live our lives as if he's really that valuable. And that's why so many other folks think that the church is full of hypocrites when we speak so powerfully about Jesus and don't even put effort into living. I ain't saying we got to be perfect. That's not what I'm saying at all. Put effort into living like him. I think sometimes we focus more on ourselves than we do on the treasure. And so here's one of the things that I'm getting at today is this. I think that the Christian church is the greatest hope for the world. I think that the Christian church is the greatest hope for the world. And maybe you're still holding out and you think that a particular political party will get in power and all the things will be solved and we'll go forward easily. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. Maybe you think that this is just a season and the kindness and goodness in people will eventually kind of come back to the surface and we'll go forward in a better state of affairs than we are now. I think that the best hope for the world is the church. But here's where it gets tricky, because it's not because the church is perfect. It's not because we have hope for the world because we're filled with all the best people. It's because we're the jars that get to carry the true treasure to people that don't know about Jesus or misunderstand him or are confused about him or that kind of thing. And the data says that fewer and fewer people, I think, are finding the treasure being carried around by all these clay jars in churches. Here's another way to say what I'm trying to get at today. The mission of the church has always been and will always be the same. It's to share the treasure. Got it. Done. The questions that I want to ask this fall, though, are do sometimes the methods need to change? In other words, are we going to kind of be introspective enough about who we are and what we are doing as a church to say, wait a second, for some reason, this could be done better. Maybe we focused a little bit too much on ourselves and not as much on the treasure. Let me see if illustration can make this clear. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. There's 4 individual pictures up there. Can you tell where I took these pictures about a year ago in preparation for exactly this sermon. Those pictures are 4 pictures that I took from inside of the Nittany Mall. Inside of the Nittany Mall. And I'm curious, you don't have to raise your hands or anything, but I'm curious how many of you kind of order your life or you're excited about, having a free Saturday sometime in the next month or two so you can get over and visit the Nittany Mall. And you're laughing because you know what the truth is. And the truth is that hardly anybody goes to the mall anymore. In fact, inside the mall, and we went there for I don't even know what reason, maybe a year ago. Inside the mall now, there's a fencing school. I don't know if you know this or not. It's like the swords, like the guys, there's a fencing school inside the Nittany Mall. There's also like a daycare, and there's also a Planet Fitness, and there's also this really weird thing where you pay money for your kids to go inside and play on things, but they have like a stuffed wolf in the front of the door. It's craziness. And so I remember when I was a little kid, and it'd be like a Saturday afternoon or something in the winter, and it's like, what else are we going to do? We might as well go over to the mall. We're going to get our Auntie Anne's pretzels. We're going to, visit Champs and the Bon-Ton and kind of make a day of it. And you'd see all the other people from Mifflin County who also were going to go over to the mall for a day and this kind of thing. And the reality is, folks, that the mall is like a shadow of itself, of what it used to be. And this is not just happening here. This is happening all over the country because nobody goes to malls anymore. Now, follow me on this. People are still buying clothes. Thank you for that. The mission of selling clothes and people buying clothes, that's still all happening. The methods have changed, right? So nowadays, you go on your Amazon, you look for 4 stars, you do whatever, right? And you get whatever you need to get, and maybe you get 3 of them, and then you send 2 back, or whatever you do. The point is, and I don't really care all that much about the mall, right? This is not about the mall. What I care about is the church. And what I'm wondering is if I'm not at all concerned with the church on a global scale, right? We know God's going to build his church, and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. I'm not concerned about that at all. And that's not happening in Asia and in South America and in Africa. Things are blowing up. What I'm concerned with is the church in America. And what I'm concerned with is thinking through, what does it look like to say, we have this insanely valuable treasure, and how are we as clay jars maybe hiding that or keeping that to ourselves or focusing on ourselves in a way that's not letting it show up in a way that's really impacting other people's lives. So this fall, here's what I want to do. I want to get excited about the treasure, number one. I think there's a lot of folks searching for meaning, and there's a lot of folks that are disenfranchised, but if they were introduced to the real Jesus, they could have more hope than they currently do. I really think that's the case. And I want to show, as Paul said in this passage, that the surpassing glory belongs to God and not to us, right? It's always tempting for any human to get involved in something. We have our mixed motives, and all of a sudden it becomes more about us than it is about God. And so I really want us to push back against that. And beyond that, folks, I really don't know what's going to happen. I know enough to know that I have more questions than answers, and I also know enough to know that I can't be the only person to lead us forward in what this church is going to become, right? I got all sorts of my own issues, and I'm very well aware of them. Thank you. Right back at you. The point is that we got to do this together, and we have the opportunity to be the hope, maybe not of the whole world, but the hope, a part of what's happening, hopefully, here in Mifflin County. So as I close, I want to go through a glimpse, kind of 10 teasers. This isn't so much application precisely, but 10 descriptions of the kinds of things. Right now, all I laid out was this framework that says the mission is share the treasure. The methods may have to change. What I want to do is share a glimpse of the kinds of things that myself and the elders are thinking through related to this for us here at Kish. So number one is this. Notice that other people exist. Notice that other people exist. In other words, Paul said it, and it's so tempting, even for myself, as I sit down here before this comes up, to focus on myself. How am I going to respond? What am I, right? But to notice and to care for other people, not just folks here, but folks outside of our church. I know that that's going to be worthwhile, and it's actually good for us because what's the problem is if you're self-centered, then you care about what's happening to you, but if you reach out to others, that helps rid us of our self-centeredness. So it's very, very healthy. Number two is to build a nexus of relationships. If you don't know what a nexus is, it looks kind of like that circle-looking thing, which says that relationships have to happen amongst all of us here. We just talked about it in the men's Sunday school class, which was basically this. Church is not a building. Church is a community of people that are sharing the treasure with other folks. It's as simple as that. And if everyone wants to be deeply known, if you want to be known, then find somebody else and get to know them, and then they'll probably get to know you as well, right? And so we need to build and intermix all these kinds of relationships within each other here. If all you do is show up on Sunday morning and you don't know anybody or interact with anybody outside of that, I just feel like we're going to have a difficult time down the road. Number three, engagement, not attendance. Engagement, not attendance. So what I mean by this is that the primary thing you do for church is not show up on a Sunday morning. The primary thing you do for church is be engaged together with this community to share the treasure of Jesus in all sorts of different ways. And that matters a whole lot more than giving people a gold star because they showed up at 52 Sundays a year or whatever the case may be. To that end, for this whole sermon series, I'm giving myself a challenge that every single Sunday I'm going to give one practical application. So it won't be a list of like 5 things, hey, do these if you want. One practical application that I'm going to ask all of us to do. It's going to be doable by every single person. And the idea there is to encourage you to get engaged by giving you on-ramps to what that looks like in your life. Number 4, build on the past. I'm a big fan of the sentence, standing on the shoulders of giants. And so you might hear me today and say something like, oh, Pastor Luke has gone off his rocker. He wants to change everything and make everything new and different than what it always was. That's not what I'm saying at all. We have a history here, not only of Richard and Carrie, not only of PD for 8,000 years. We have a history here, right? But the history goes back further than even Kish, right? It's like a 2,000-year history. And if folks want to be cynical about things in the world, one of the most amazing things is that the Christian church is one of the longest-lasting institutions in this world, right? Like countries come and go, businesses come and go, universities come and go, all that stuff comes and goes. The Christian church has like a 2,000-year history. And so we want to go back to all that stuff, the early church, all the theology, even what's happened here at Kish, and anything helpful, we want to keep that stuff. Anything unhelpful, we want to get rid of it. Number 5, when I did, many of you may or may not remember this, we gave out a survey maybe a year ago, a little less than a year ago, about my performance, and a lot of people responded to that. And one of the things I got out of that, and I'm trying to keep growing as a pastor, was this. Some people said, well, there's not a lot of gospel presentations in sermons, or we'd like to see more of that or something along those lines. So what I'm going to do is this. I hear that, and so on November the 14th, I'm going to have a sermon that's going to be primarily only a gospel presentation for everybody. So if that's you, if you're here and saying, I need to know about this gospel, be here on November 14th. If that's your family or friends or whoever, invite them on November 14th. And there'll be a chance to really expand or share the gospel with people here. Number 6, unity. Here's a fascinating thing. If Jesus is the treasure, and he's like infinitely worth being excited about, then why do some churches want to hold that treasure within themselves over and against those other churches? Right? Like if Jesus is big enough that we want to give him absolutely as much glory as possible, why wouldn't we work alongside of other churches that are doing that? Right? Like if they're preaching Jesus and trying to call people to Jesus, then we're all on the same team. And so we're going to be talking about stuff like that this coming sermon series. Number 7, a focus on truth. A focus on truth. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of folks these days, I think, who are saying something like, yeah, what are you trying to get from me? Like you're saying this truth, but really you just want to, tell me that you're right and I'm wrong, or be judgmental, or all this kind of stuff. And so how do we share, if Jesus is the truth, how do we share that truth in a way that welcomes people into that truth instead of pushes them further away? Number 8, intergenerational focus. I very often think of our church here as a family, and just like a regular healthy family has maybe little babies, some kids, some teens, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, the whole deal. Just like that, we ought to have that here. And so I'm convinced that our future health is going to mean that we need to keep all those pieces engaged and relating to each other. It's not just, you have gray hair, you go over here and be with the other gray hair folks. That's not helpful, right? I need a lot more gray hair in my life and not just on my head. Number 9, the treasure. There's 2 options. If you think about like marketing or trying to convince someone of something, there's sort of 2 options that you have. One of those options is to say, the thing I have is not really that great, but I'll just lie to you and try to make it sound a lot better than it actually is and try to convince you and be a salesperson about that thing. The second option is to have something that is really super great, and then all you have to do is tell the truth about it. And so if Jesus is as great as we say he is, and we're getting to know him in that kind of a way, then it simply becomes, let me just tell you the truth about Jesus and what he's doing in my life. Number 10, let me end with this one. Last week I said that, we said, the elders together and I said that it's going to be essential that we move forward with a focus on prayer. And the reason for that is because if God is not central to this thing, then it's so easy to turn, just like that, it can turn to be about promoting ourselves and not the actual treasure. And so the first application for this sermon series I'm going to share with you now is up on the screen. It says to pray for our church for 15 minutes this week. It's not outlandish, it's not a crazy thing, but in my mind, if there's however many folks are here today and we're all spending 15 minutes praying that God would do something great through our church, that the treasure would be known and the jars would be kind of, right, we're not going to promote ourselves, we're going to promote the treasure, then I think he would be pretty excited about that. All right, let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you are the ultimate treasure, and that while it's always so tempting for us to, from our own perspective, just focus on what I need, what I want, what is fun for me, what is good for me, what I like, that ultimately the healthiest place we can be at is to focus on sharing the treasure. And that frees us from the paralyzing state of always being upset and angry when things don't go the way we want them to. And so I pray, Lord, for our church here, for Kish, that you would help us forward, that you would give us clarity for myself and for the elders and the deacons, but also for everybody here, that this would be a unifying experience with an excitement about what it is that you're up to. I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.